So I'm going to talk about historical empathy. And historical empathy is the ability to emphatically comprehend history, to perceive and understand past people's lived experiences and actions from their point of view. And the reason why that is important, hopefully I'll be able to show this to you now, because as an educator, of course, I have a little exercise with me. So I'll invite you all now, if you're comfortable, to close your eyes. Imagine that you have a time machine. This time machine can go anywhere, any place and any time in recorded history. And you decide one day to go on an adventure to your favorite point in history, time and place, certain event. And you enter that time machine, you crank it up, it's an old timey-wimey one, and you're back in the past, your chosen destination. You exit the time machine and you look around. You might be in a bustling city or town. You might be in a remote location, a farm, a castle, mountain, or maybe an ancient temple. It's up to you. The important thing is that you really take in the impressions of this place. Try and look around and see your surroundings. What does it look like? What colors are there? What things are happening around you? Do you hear anything? Is there a soundscape to this place? Is there a certain smell? Is that smell bad or good? Maybe it's very familiar and very strange. Is there something here you can touch, you can interact with to get that tactile sensation, and try touching it? How does it feel? Also try to consider what time of the day it is. Is it light out? Or do you need to light your way? What time of the year is it? What's the weather like? And maybe most importantly, is something happening right now? That's the reason why you chose this time and place. Give yourself one last moment to take in all of these impressions. And then you decide that's enough adventure for one day. So you go back into the time machine, crank it up again, and then you jump back to the present and you can open your eyes. Of course, I am very curious about what you visualized, but the talk is actually not really about that. So come find me afterwards if you want to tell me. Now the question is, who did you visualize? So a show of hands, and those of you who were watching online, Josephine is posting it in the Discord chat now to get the question. How many of you visualized people around you? Can I see a show of hands? Yeah. So the rest of you didn't visualize anyone. You're just there by yourself. That's fine. There's no right or wrong answer here. Those of you who visualize people, did you visualize their faces? Yeah, some of you. Did you notice their expressions? Even fewer. Their emotions, what they were doing? Still some of you. That's good. You actually don't have to stay for the keynote. You're done. That was it. You are welcome to stay anyways. The reason why I'm asking this, the reason why I'm asking whether you notice these people or they were just like background extras, not really doing anything, not really feeling anything, is because there is often a disconnect between the reader or the person who interacts with history and the actual people having experienced and lived that past. This is not like necessarily a mind-blowing thing. This is my experience as a historian, as an educator, is that history often feels dead and empty when we interact with it. And it's not very strange, because when we go and visit a historical site, it's often a ruin, devoid of human life, except the other tourists there. If we go to a museum, it's that artifact from the past behind glass that we can't interact with. It's only if we really go to a living history museum or something like that, where we can get a sense of what the past was actually like. And when we talk about education, that disconnect can make it really difficult for students and participants, not just, the kids, to engage with history and actually understand it. And that is where LARP comes into the picture. Because LARP as a teaching tool can open the door to the past, and it can give us the opportunity to understand and emphasize with other people's lived experiences, and thereby facilitating historical and cultural empathy. In no way am I saying that we can one-to-one replicate someone's lived experience. That's impossible. All lived experiences are unique. So that is not what LARP can do. But LARP can show us some of the nuances that would be hidden if you just read it in a book. Imagine being a student and you're maybe studying for an exam, or you're just curious about the past. So you open up a history book, and what you're met with is a list of events. Maybe it's dates you need to memorize for an exam, names you need to remember, often just names of a select few people in history who made decisions. But what they felt making those decisions, why they made those decisions, is not necessarily clear. And how those decisions affected the lives of other people is often just like a footnote in the book, if there at all. And if we can in some way create a connection between that reader of history and the past, suddenly we can make these things make sense on a completely different level. So we can't recreate the past, unfortunately, but we can recreate a version of it or an aspect of it and let participants engage with that, and thereby gain an understanding or an empathic personal connection to the past that makes that much more living, much more engaging. I would like to give you an example of this. And it's not an educational LARP, and it's not my LARP either. But it is a historical LARP, and it's very, very recent. Because just 2 weeks ago in Skien in Norway, the LARP Allegiance was ran. The concept design was by Martin Nielsen and Ida Foss, and a long list of very talented designers from 9 different countries. That is in itself a feat to pull off. The setting of this LARP was the Cold War, more specifically 1970. And the participants were invited to learn more about this specific time in history by, for example, a communal watching or viewing of a Cold War documentary online. So history was a very active aspect of this LARP. The LARP itself was focusing on the conflicting loyalties, the allegiances in a world on the edge of war. Players, participants portrayed diplomats from different embassies of the world, trying to navigate this very difficult political landscape of the Cold War, discussing nuclear arms, cultural exchanges, in general, trying to avoid to get themselves into too much trouble and maybe, make a better world for their children. And in this design, culture and language was super important, both design-wise, but also in the play, because designers and players alike, they portrayed their own countries. So you had 9 different countries represented with talking different languages, portraying different nationalities, and thereby creating something that resembled our real world a bit more than when we are in, let's say, a traditional LARP setting where we all either speak English together or the native language we play in. Of course, when the designers started working on this LARP, The Cold War was a thing of the past. The idea of a Europe split in East and West, of dooming nuclear threat, that was way, way back. That was not the case when this law was around 2 weeks ago, as we all know. That meant that allegiance did not only interact with the past, it also framed the now in a different way. That meant that allegiance did not only open the door to the past, creating the possibility of historical empathy by letting participants engage with this story, with these themes, having these discussions as politicians. It also opened the door to the present by giving the participants a shared experience across borders, across nationalities, and giving the participants the possibility of looking each other in the eye and gain that cultural understanding, that sort of empathy with each other's lived experience in the now and the challenges we all face in this rather recent change of the political landscape. Allegiance was a LARP that took place over, as you can see, 3 days. That is very rarely the case when you do a LARP in a museum context. And to show you some of the challenges that we have to navigate if we're trying to create not just a historical LARP, but an educational LARP in a museum context, I've tried to list some of our, I know it's supposed to be called challenges, but I'll actually do the bad thing and call them problems, because it can really be difficult to translate this. First of all, there's the physical limitations. If you design something that is for a cultural site, a museum, especially if it's a historical museum, you often have to deal with very old buildings. Those old buildings have very small rooms. They're not very good for creating an educational lab. Furthermore, you have to share those rooms with actually historical items. Those things can break. I hope that's not because you've broken a historical. No. Yeah, that's not good. It's not just the items that can break, unfortunately. It's also the exhibition design, because very often those things made out of glass can be surprisingly fragile. And if we're lucky enough that it is a museum, let's say a living history, or a museum that has a big collection of things you can actually engage with and interact with, sometimes those things have to be handled very carefully. So we cannot just give participants actual real suits on from 100 years ago and let them run out into the snow and have a snowball fight. That's not possible. We also have some limitations that have to do with time. We cannot do a several-day LARP, as I mentioned. Very often we have a limitation that is 3, maybe 4 hours max, because museums and the like are what you can consider an external learning site, meaning that participants have to come visit us. If they go to school, they have to do it during the school day, and they can't be there the whole day very often. If it's after school hours, after work hours, there's also a limit to how long you can go before people need to go home to bed. There's also a different kind of time limitation, which is the time of year. That might seem a bit strange, but old buildings can also be very cold in winter. I told someone earlier during lunch about having an office space where you actually needed to wear your winter coat while at work during the winter because it was so poorly insulated there. And if you're lucky enough to be at a historical site where you can utilize the outdoor areas, those can often only be used during the summer and only when the weather is good. So there are some very clear practical challenges designing for museum context. Then there's also costuming and prop conservation. I know that, Josephine, you have told about the immense workload of having to do laundry when running Edu-larps. We might be lucky at museums that we don't have to do that much laundry because they're maybe indoors. But something I didn't know before I started working there is conservation and organic material do not go well together. Fabric is an organic material, which means that you need to deep freeze it in an industrial freezer down below minus 40 something degrees Celsius, technically every time it has been used for 3 days. That doesn't happen, let me tell you that. But maybe once a month to be sure that you don't accidentally destroy your whole collection because some bug has taken residence in your costume department. Apart from that, there are the challenges that has to do with the participants. And that is a general one when it comes to designing Edu-larps. You never know what kind of participant walks in through the door. Maybe you know if it's a school where they come from or their year, but that can pretty much be it. That makes it very difficult to know whether the people arriving know anything about the time, the history you want them to engage with. It makes it very difficult to know whether they have any sort of experience larping at all. So you have to create a learning design that does not only concern the historical piece you want them to gain knowledge about. You also need to design on top of that the learning experience of how to interact with that topic, how to larp. It ties in with the next point I have up here, which is preparation and post-experience. And post-experience could be called post-game because it's some of the same things. As we do not know how much time they've been able to prepare, we also don't know if they'll continue working on this afterwards. And we don't know whether the participants themselves, if they have any tools to do that after work or after care. And we don't know whether the teachers bringing students, if it's a class, whether they do. That creates a really big challenge because we only have maybe 3 to 4 hours. So we need to both onboard them, teach them how to larp, then they need to engage with the learning that we have designed for. And then we also really need to do all of that post-experience, post-game education before they go out the door. To give you an example of how different these groups of participants can be, I have had participants who did not know where they were going that very same morning. Randomly, they were told, this is what we're doing today, class. And then they went to a museum and then they had to do a larp. I've also had a group of students who prepared for more than 2 weeks, getting taught in school how it felt being a kid around 1900, how it was going to school, how they should interact with someone being a teacher, which was my role, was the stern teacher of this countryside school. When they arrived, all the girls had their hair braided, some of them wearing scarves around their heads, classical dresses. I did not need to put on costumes. They were ready. All the boys had their hair combed back with water. Some of them had time-fitting, caps on. They were ready to go. They already stood up. I was like, yes, teacher, what can we do today to please you? I was like, hey, I'm going to, educate you for the next 3 hours, and you already know everything I have to bring to the table. So there's a big variety in the kind of participants we have to engage with and design for. Then there are 2 more challenges, and they get their own slides because they are really important and they really have to do with the theme, historical empathy. First of all, there is participant motivation. The participants very often lack agency. It's not always the case, but very often they're doing this LARP. They're visiting the museum because someone has told them they have to. Whether it be a teacher, a parent, very rarely it's the participants themselves that want to engage with this. That means that we have to start on a very low level when it comes to motivation. The motivation is often extrinsic. Extrinsic motivation is motivation that is based on external rewards or to avoid punishment. So they're doing it because the teachers told them they had to. They need to do it to prepare for a test they'll get back in school. They're doing it to avoid getting detention if they don't show up. Nothing of this have to do with what they actually want to do. That also means that potentially their focus and interest down here. My worst experience with this was not a lot, but it was education, was a group of students, of teenagers that came to the National Museum of Denmark, to the capital. And they lived the other end of the country. And they were so excited to be in the capital. This thing, my education, was the last item this day, Friday afternoon. The thing they're going to do after I was done teaching was to go to the local amusement park, Tivoli. They were not interested in listening to me for an hour and a half, educate them about history at all. They were not focused. They were talking with each other, planning that Tivoli trip. They were, you know, the whole social hierarchy of their school's classroom situation had changed because they were out and about. So they were really interested in figuring out their social, you know, structure in this new setting. I couldn't do anything. They should not be there. That means we really have some challenges when we try to educate these students or these participants. But luckily, the challenge can also be the solution, because LARP is really good at changing that extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is motivation that's based on personal rewards and satisfaction. That means you engage with something because you want to, because it gives you something. You're curious about it, or you realize that you gain a certain skill by doing this and you really want that skill. So it's your own drive to engage with something. That's intrinsic motivation. And if we use LARP as a teaching tool, we can be able to create a personal connection. And that personal connection to an investment in history can make that historic empathy possible. Simply because the students or the participants invest themselves in this historical scenario, they engage with it, they empathize with it, they suddenly get some of those nuances of the past lived experiences, because some of those lived experiences become their own lived experiences. And therefore, they can suddenly understand why that guy in that history book did that thing, made that decision. Because maybe they have gone through a scenario where they have had to make the exact same decision themselves. So luckily, motivation is a twofold thing. Both be a problem, but we can also design for it. We might have students who cannot be reached with this. We also have to realize that, because especially in a museum setting, we will have students who are disengaged, because museums in Denmark, at least, are often considered these like dusty old places where nothing happens. Whether that's true or not, I will not be the judge. I'm very biased. But students who are disinterested. But that actually also makes it even more exciting when they then realize that that's actually not the case. That they now get to go on an adventure, jump into a time machine they did not anticipate at all. I'm going to jump to ethics, and it might feel like a big jump, but the reason why I'm doing it is because if we realize that LARP can be a super powerful tool, we also need to use it carefully, especially if we try to design for historical and cultural themes. I can rant about this in its own keynote. So if you want to discuss ethics, please come talk with me. I think it is so incredibly important because we need to consider what stories we tell. What stories are ethical to tell? Is it ethical to tell the story of colonial slave trade? Is it ethical to tell the story of prison inmates in a concentration camp? Is it ethical to tell the story of prison guards in a concentration camp? We also need to consider who tells these stories. If we recognize that all lived experiences are unique, the natural next step will be to realize that the further we are removed from each other in time and space and culture, the more different those lived experiences can be. So when we use history and historical themes and cases in our design work, we also need to realize that not everyone might be able to tell every story. They might simply be too far removed from it to tell it. And that ties in with the next thing. How do we tell these stories? What kind of feel do we want the participants to have? Do you want them to be excited and happy? Then there are some historical themes we shouldn't include. Then there might be designers who are not right for that job. We also need to consider what our learning output is, both when it comes to who tells these stories and how they're told. Because, and in no way do I have the answer here, but a very typical question would be some of these examples I gave of ethical or not stories. Let's say the prison guards in a concentration camp. If we decide we want to design a LARP that touches on this group of people and their lived experiences, do we want the students or the participants to emphasize with these people? The answer might be no, we do not want them to do that. We do not want them to emphasize with the ideology that they might represent. But the answer could also be yes, we would actually like them to emphasize with this group of people that are considered horrible people, because we want the students to understand how these people could make those decisions so the students can avoid making them in the future. But it is a very fine balance. And it's really important that we consider that we do not end up with the LARP equivalent of a selfie stick. Because if we design LARPs with strong, heavy historical themes or cultural themes, we might end up with the LARP equivalent of voyeurism or dark tourism. Dark tourism is defined as acts of tourism that visits places that have to do with the dark chapters of our history. It could be places of suffering, of murder, all of these horrible parts of our history. And if we design LARPs that has to do with these themes, we might have participants who come and participate in them, not because they're interested in gaining knowledge about this historical period, this theme, or they might not be interested in gaining any sort of historical empathy. They might just be there because they think it's fun to play pretend human suffering. Do we want that kind of participants? Maybe we do, but then we need to consider how we design to change their mindset from this is just fun to, oh, I actually gained a knowledge that I did not consider I would gain by participating. We also need to make it very clear what we expect of the participants and what they can expect of us, because we really need to avoid the creation or recreation of negative emotions and conflicts. If we get a group of students, especially if we get a group of students. And we ask them to pretend that they are participants in some sort of war, and they have to fight each other. We might end up, when they leave the museum, with students who are angry with each other, who are sad, who are hurt, who has a lot of negative emotions and sudden conflicts in the classroom situation that we cannot help them with because they have left. I can give you examples of how this can be avoided, but that is its own talk. The important thing is to be considerate when you create designs that have cultural and historical themes, what you put into that group of participants and what you leave them with, not just when it comes to knowledge, but also when it comes to conflicts and emotions, because LARP can be such a strong tool. And that brings me to my conclusion. LARP can be used as a learning tool, and it's a really great learning tool in many ways to facilitate this historical and cultural understanding, thereby creating this historical empathy towards the lived experience of the past. But if we use history and culture as the framework for a LARP design, then it necessitates a consciousness regarding ethics and the stories we decide to tell. Thank you very much.